Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
To the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this episode should be coming to you in the middle of May. And slowly but surely, the theater industry, much like life, is starting to slowly resemble something close to normal. And while we are not all the way there, maybe it's just the nice weather, maybe it's just more and more people getting vaccinated with more and more COVID restrictions being lifted, but there are things that are going on right now that gives me a little bit of hope that in some very minor ways we are on the uptick from the pandemic. And as it relates to the film industry, I'm definitely seeing it just in terms of the amount of films that are hitting theaters, how much box office is being made, and an increase in projects either being announced or resuming shooting is giving credence to the number one motto in show business, and that is the show must go on. I for one am happy to see it, as it's getting pretty old shifting through B material when it comes to selecting the films that I talk about on this podcast, and I have definitely noticed an increase in at least intrigue and compelling premises in the films that have been hitting theaters in recent weeks. And if they're not compelling in the sense they have an intriguing plot, at least they're providing me with a few more talking points. And I would say the first film I'll be talking about on this episode most likely falls under that category, and that is the film Spiral from the Book of Saw, which, yes, is the latest installment from the Saw franchise. All these years later, it's still going, and it has the star power of people like Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson in this installment to draw in audiences. So, for whatever reason, the Saw franchise can still draw in an audience, and that is what we're going to be talking about on this segment. After that, we will be continuing in the theme of the horror genre with the new film Profile. This film tells the story of a British journalist who is trying to infiltrate a terrorist group and expose the recruiter. It is a found footage type of film where it's pretty much told all through webcam footage, with the characters simply interacting with their computers. That film should be interesting to talk about for a few reasons, and in our third segment, we're going to go for the triple play of horror, which was completely inadvertent, but these are the films that interested me the most, so hopefully you will find them interesting as well. But the final film we'll be talking about is The Unthinkable, which has the distinction of being the first foreign language film I talk about on this podcast. It is a Swedish film, and it has the premise of all TV, phone, and internet networks going down at the same time. I think that is a very intriguing premise when you just take a look at how the average human being is so reliant on technology from both a professional and social standpoint, and the ability to send and receive information in the blink of an eye is really something a lot of people would have difficulty coping with. And anybody under the age of 16 nowadays would be absolutely helpless if that was to happen. So it'll be fun to play around with the idea around the premise of The Unthinkable. And if you are a fan of those quote-unquote apocalypse type scenarios, be sure to stick around until our third segment. And you'll want to stick around until our final segment if you are a fan of box office totals. With this being the month of May, and May usually being the start of blockbuster season, I thought I would take a look back at the most profitable Mays that we have experienced at the movie theater. I will be taking a look at the years where the month of May was able to rake in over $1 billion at the box office, and what films were in theaters at the time to make that possible. I think this topic will be fun, so if you want to stick around and have a boatload of fun with me, it would really mean a lot. And if you don't, whatever. You never meant that much to me in the first place. So, we have all that coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast. But right now, for regular listeners, you know what time it is. It is time for a film from the book, 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. And this is a movie I have seen a million times. It has been on TV a lot lately. I've pretty much tuned in every time I've seen it. And it is one of those movies that I just think is a perfect movie. I will explain what I mean by that a little bit later on, but without further ado, the film is Back to the Future. This is a film I know a lot of people have seen already, but I cannot recommend enough that you go see it if you have not. And if you have not, this is a point where I would really like to swear on this podcast to just drive home how serious I am about this. But I'll give you the G-rated version of my point. Get all your poop together, put all your poop into a suitcase, take your poop with you to Netflix, where you can now stream Back to the Future, as well as its 2 sequels if it really gets you in the mood. But at the very least, I am asking you to watch the original Back to the Future so you can get lost into a world of complete science fiction fantasy, a very fun what-if scenario, and a film dyad in Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, where you will see some of the best chemistry between actors in any medium. For now, though, we are going to overlook the slightly Oedipal theme of the film and just talk about the fun parts. The film is directed by Robert Zemeckis, who would go on to direct Forrest Gump, and the executive producer is Steven Spielberg, with the premise of the film emanating from Bob Gale, who co-wrote the film, looking through one of his parents' yearbooks, and him wondering if, had he been at school with them at the same time, would they have been friends? That fairly simple idea grew into the quintessential time travel movie and the sleeper hit of 1985, which is where the movie starts off with Michael J. Fox's character of Marty McFly growing up with a pushover of a dad and an alcoholic mother. But one night that all changes when his friend Doc Brown, who is a former nuclear physicist, and it's not really explained why these two are friends, and it's not really important because the on-screen dynamic between the two of them is amazing. Anyway, Marty McFly's friend, Dr. Emmett Brown, has unlocked the secret to time travel, and he built a time machine out of a DeLorean. And for those of you listening on the younger side who don't know what a DeLorean is, it is a car from Back to the Future, and it is also the car that is co-opted for the film adaptation of Ready Player One, which not so coincidentally was directed by Steven Spielberg. But back to the Future, Marty inadvertently travels back to the year 1955, which drops him into the same age group as his parents. He ends up meeting both of them, and screws up the first time they meet each other. After meeting up with the younger version of Doc Brown, Marty not only has to figure out how to get back to the year 1985, but he has to ensure that his parents are put back on the path to falling in love, getting married, and having kids to ensure Marty's existence, and keep him from fading away into nothing. Not only is this an incredibly entertaining film, but I really do believe it is a perfect movie. Like, throw out all the impossible logic that surrounds time travel. It is a perfect movie in the sense that it sets up and pays off everything in an incredibly consistent and satisfying fashion, in addition to having one of the best scores in cinema history, done by Alan Silvestri, and the rest of the soundtrack features music by Huey Lewis in his prime with the ultimate hit, Power of Love. So to anyone who has not seen Back to the Future, go watch it now, and then go back in time, tell your past self about how great the movie is so you could have seen it earlier in your life. But shifting from a classic film from yesteryear, I want to talk about a new film that I don't anticipate is going to be a classic, but for some reason, this next film is the latest installment in a franchise that, for better or worse, just refuses to go away. I am, of course, talking about the new Saw film, Spiral, from the Book of Saw, which will be the 9th feature film in a franchise that all started out as a single low-budget horror movie that was filmed in 18 days. Since the first installment from 2004, Saw really just went through a period of being a part of the yearly Halloween cycle, as from 2004 to 2010, you could set your watch to another installment being released before Halloween. After that, there was a 7-year lull, but Hollywood producers gotta revive all pre-sold intellectual properties, and as a result, we got the movie Jigsaw. Now, after a 4-year layoff, we have the movie Spiral, and there are plans to make a Saw 10. So, as long as people like gore porn, as it's called, I guess we are still going to be getting installments in the Saw franchise. This installment, however, has come a long way from its humble beginnings, as it stars Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson. And the two of them being in this film make me just wonder, are they in this film because Saw is trying to use them to create a buzz and get people re-involved in the franchise, or are they involved in this project because they're Saw, that'll create a buzz for my career? Because as far as Chris Rock's acting career goes, since he did those Grown-Ups films, he hasn't really been in demand. But quite the opposite with Samuel L. Jackson. He never needs to do another movie as long as he lives. He has cranked out a ton of quality films over his career, and even his ludicrous ones like Deep Blue Sea still have a certain level of appeal to them. But again, I just find it strange that a franchise that was really built on having a bunch of lesser-known actors in them, where for a long time the highest profile name involved in them was Donnie Wahlberg, to now be at the point where they're bringing in veteran actors like Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson and sort of steering the franchise away from being just graphic images of violence to being what appears to be some sort of detective thriller. But to give a quick synopsis of the film, Chris Rock's character plays a police officer who is in the shadow of Samuel L. Jackson's character. But anyway, Chris Rock's character of Ezekiel is investigating a case that is similar to the crimes that appeared in the previous Saw films, as in this universe, those were things that actually took place. Unfortunately for Ezekiel, during his investigation, he actually gets involved in the killer's sick game and has to find a way out of this situation. And I'm just going to say this as someone who has never even seen a Saw film. I know bits and pieces of the franchise's story, but my prediction for this movie, and I feel it's kind of obvious, Samuel L. Jackson's going to be the bad guy. Without even talking about the plot, just from a sheer movie-making standpoint, you don't bring in two people the caliber of Samuel L. Jackson and Chris Rock merely to have them have an on-screen battle with, instead of no name, I'll go with the term lesser-known actor. So merely for that reason, I think someone's betraying someone, and I think it's going to be the quote-unquote last person you'd expect, and that is going to be the veteran police officer that is held in such high regard. So, as I think it's going to be Samuel L. Jackson that turns out to be the film's main killer, this leads me to another interesting aspect of the film, as this will be the first Saw film that will not include Tobin Bell. For those of you who are familiar with the franchise, you know that he is the iconic Jigsaw killer, and he is literally the one pulling the strings behind that weird little puppet guy. But since he will not be reprising his role, the killer in this film is supposed to be a copycat, trying to pay tribute to his previous crimes. And once again, if we're placing bets, my money is on Samuel L. Jackson being that copycat. But regardless of who the killer ends up being, this film is mostly going to focus on Chris Rock's character, both while he is in pursuit of the killer and while he is being tortured by the killer. So I guess the real suspense element of this film is whether or not his character survives it or not. Will Chris Rock make it to Saw 10? In order to find that out, you're going to have to go see Spiral from the Book of Saw. For those of you interested in seeing it, it will be making a nationwide release Friday, May 14th. And of course, this film is rated R for the following reasons: sequences of grisly, bloody violence and torture, perverse language, some sexual references, and brief drug use. I do like how they include the perverse language warning when you consider this is a film franchise that started out with people sawing off their foot. I know that they're required to give that warning, but if you're going into a movie where you are going to see that type of content, if naughty words are even on your radar as something you're worried about, I suggest you do a little self-examination and sort out your priorities. But nonetheless, if you are in the mood for a horror film, check out the movie Spiral from the Book of Saw. And if you are in the mood for a lot of horror films, stay tuned for the rest of this episode because by pure coincidence, those are the only types of film we are going to be talking about. After a quick break, I will be talking about the new film Profile, which follows the story of a London reporter who is trying to infiltrate a terrorist organization and expose their online recruiter. Not only does this film Profile contain an interesting premise, but it's going to be shot pretty much solely through the point of view of a webcam. So that will be cool to see executed. And this film is really supposed to shed light on just how susceptible people are to the information they come in contact with on the internet and on social media platforms. Like, of all the things that you can come into contact with via social media, probably joining a terrorist organization is the worst of them. Yet we are going to see the main character struggle with the idea of being radicalized. And while the premise of joining a terrorist organization is a very extreme example of the pitfalls you can fall into while being online, it is not unfounded to say that right now people are very susceptible to persuasion when on the internet. All you have to do is look at an organization like QAnon, see all the misinformation that they spread, and the following that they have cultivated online. So once again, this film Profile will be interesting to take a look at and discuss the topic of just the general dangers we are susceptible to on the internet. That will be coming up in our next segment, so stick around for that. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as since this episode will be coming to you in the middle of May, I have decided now is as good a time as any to take a look at the years where May was very profitable at the box office by examining the years where theaters raked in over $1 billion, as well as taking a look at the films that made that possible. So be sure to stick around. We have all that and more coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in the last segment, I just finished talking about Spiral from the Book of Saw, which will be the 9th installment of the Saw franchise, and this film will star Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson. The two of them play police officers that get a whiff of a killer who's essentially a copycat of Jigsaw from the original films. While Chris Rock is investigating the case, he actually gets captured and is now going to be part of the killer's twisted game. And to anyone who missed out on the last segment, once again, I just want to let you know that if we are putting money down on who the killer is going to be, I am going with Samuel L. Jackson. So time will tell. And if you are interested in seeing this film, it is the first Saw film that will not be coming out just before Halloween in October. It will be coming out Friday, May 14th, and it will be in theaters nationwide. So if you're looking to get your horror fix on, be sure to check out Spiral from the Book of Saw. And if you are in the mood for a horror-type film but are looking more for a suspenseful thriller type movie, be sure to check out the film Profile. That's the main film we're going to be talking about on this segment of the podcast. Profile is a found footage movie where it's basically told from the point of view of a webcam, and it tells the story of a British reporter who's trying to expose a terrorist organization that recruits people through the internet and social media. Now, recruiting people to join a terrorist organization is a bit of an extreme example of the dangers that you could get into while online and talking to people you don't know. But things like this have happened, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to social media and the current climate we are living in when it comes to that medium. So it will be interesting to take a look at Profile and dissect that topic on a grander scale. And like I said, I'll be getting to that film a little bit later on in this segment, and be sure to stick around until the final segment of the show, as I'm going to take a look at May at the box office. We are halfway through the year's fifth month, and I decided to take a look at the years where May totaled over $1 billion at the box office. And of course, I'll be taking a look at the films that made that possible, which should be a lot of fun as May is usually considered the kickoff of the blockbuster season. So be sure to stick around for that, and while we're on the topic of the box office, that's a perfect transition into the box office report.
And I do have to open up by saying that last week was not a good week at the box office. For reference, I'm talking about the week between April 30th and May 5th, and the total brought in by the top 10 films dropped by over 55% from the previous week. The main factor with that is probably that all the buzz surrounding Mortal Kombat was essentially spent in that film's first week at the box office. While it did still manage to remain the number one grossing film in the country, the film only managed to bring in 1/4 of what it was able to generate the previous week. And from what I've heard about this film, and by what I've heard about what I saw on Screen Junkie's Honest trailer this week, was that the whole film is really just building up in hopes that there will be a sequel, which will actually deliver the martial arts tournament that you were promised in this one. Which I can imagine would be incredibly frustrating for people that actually shelled out money to go and see this film. But I think it's frustrating that a studio is even taking that approach when it comes to building a cinematic experience and essentially using one film as just a blatant setup for the next film. And if they're trying to follow the blueprint that Marvel Studios set out, the whole reason people loved the MCU is because these films were all self-contained with their own individual storylines that eventually came together for the epic crossover that's now known as the MCU. It didn't start out with, we're going to make Iron Man, the Hulk, Thor, and Captain America, and hopefully that will build up to the Avengers. They knocked it out of the park with Iron Man, did an alright job with the Incredible Hulk, and while they were developing Thor and Captain America, it then occurred to them that this was a realistic possibility to make all these film franchises cross over with each other. So if film studios are going to now take the approach where the first film is solely supposed to be an introduction and there's not going to be much in the way of plot, as the first installment is just supposed to be a setup to get people hooked and interested in the next film, that would be the ultimate example of pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. But wrapping up this mini tangent, and the moral of the story is, Mortal Kombat made $7.4 million last week. Moving on to the next film on the list, which comes in at number 2, is the Demon Slayer Mugen Train, and I think I'm closer to pronouncing that right this week. But this is an animated film from Japan, and I'm just completely surprised that this is even getting a run in theaters, let alone it is one of the highest performing films of the year so far. It racked up another $6.4 million last week, bringing its domestic total to over $34 million. But probably the most impressive number attached to this film from its first week to its second week is the fact that it was played in 658 more theaters. So, clearly, I wasn't the only one surprised by its success, as the theaters that actually order films did not expect it to do as well as it has, and as a result, they're trying to jump on the bandwagon while people may still be interested in the film.
And even if Demon Slayer is just a flash in the pan and its popularity fizzles, it's still very impressive that the movie was able to bring in $34 million at the domestic box office. And who knows, maybe this will start a trend where animated films from other countries get bigger pull in theaters. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing, as I'll be the first one to tell you that American studios pretty much crank out crap film after crap film. And yes, I'm aware we are going through a chaotic global event, but to just highlight that point a little bit further, the 8th highest grossing film in the country last week was the re-release of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. For some goddamn reason, someone somewhere felt the need to commemorate the 10th anniversary of this film, and it pulled in over $1 million. Like, I'm a fan of Michael Cera. I've watched him since he was in Arrested Development, even saw crappy films of his like Nick and Nora's Infinite Playlist. I was unable to get through Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. It just, top to bottom, was a terrible experience. It's built off of the one-note premise of, look, it's a dorky guy. He's so awkward and uncoordinated, but hey, he loves someone, so he's gonna overcome any obstacle that's in his way. That movie that is 10 years old, that you can watch at home on Netflix, was the 8th most popular theatrical release of the week. Which I really just have to say, figure it out, movie studios. But getting back to the box office report, rounding out the top 3 is Godzilla vs. Kong, which I guess, skipped a week at the box office because I can't find any numbers on it last week. So I guess this is one of those situations where absence makes the heart grow fonder, because Monkey vs. Lizard was able to rake in another $3.4 million, bringing its running total up to $91 million. And for any movie to be making that kind of money in this current climate, I think is very encouraging for the upcoming releases that are still to come this year. So hopefully Giant Primate versus Giant Reptile is going to be a precursor for the other tentpole films that will start making their way to theaters shortly. Though we are still in the phase of the movie calendar where films with less hype surrounding them are hitting the big screen, that makes it all the more interesting when one performs well, which is the case with the number 4 film at the box office last week, and that is the film Separation. This is one of those horror films that I have to imagine was set for release in October, but like most things, it has been delayed until now, and it was able to draw in $2.3 million at the box office. To give a quick synopsis of the film, as it is one of the lesser known ones hitting theaters, and this is the word for word line I'm reading off of the site where I get these stats from. A young girl finds solace in her artist father and the ghost of her mother. Not really sure what that is all about, but it was compelling enough of a premise to bring people to the theaters. Other notable performers that were able to gross above the $1 million mark were Raya and the Last Dragon, Nobody, the Bob Odenkirk film, and The Unholy. And then, of course, the lovely re-release of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Whoop-de-doo, Basil. But that will pretty much do it for the box office report. I got really lost in the numbers and really need to be moving on so we can talk about our main feature, which is the film Profile. This new release will be hitting theaters Friday, May 14th, and it is based on a true story about how a British reporter essentially went undercover and tried to catfish a terrorist recruiter. She was posing as someone sympathetic to the cause, but her true motive was really just to find out who the people doing this online recruiting was and expose them. While she is doing this undercover journalism, she actually does struggle with not getting sucked into their propaganda, and that is really what the film is supposed to portray. Both the dangers of and how easy it is to get sucked into radical propaganda on the internet. As I said earlier, this film is shot in a found footage type of style, so pretty much the entire film is going to be taken from point of view shots of webcams and camera phones, and that's really supposed to illustrate just how readily available and accessible interactions like this are now. And that's something that's really just worth taking a pause and thinking about. You are now able to have a essentially face-to-face conversation with a terrorist recruiter. And I will give you, yes, that is a very extreme example, and the probability of that happening is fairly low, but these are situations that are now possible due to technology. More and more impressionable minds have access to social media and could get involved in things where they are way in over their head. Now, the vast majority of people probably won't come in contact with a terrorist recruiter, but this film Profile is based off of real events, and even if it's not something as extreme, no pun intended, as a terrorist group, but if you're on social media, you are exposed to a ton of crap and misinformation. It's really just a package deal. We all have people in our network that just can't help themselves from posting misinformation, commenting on topics where they're completely out of their depth. And I think we really saw that taken to the extreme during the pandemic, how there were people that came out of the woodwork with their secret medical degree and knew everything there was to know about the coronavirus. Now, if you're a rational human being, you're able to dismiss this, realize who is saying this information, and say maybe the person who posts a selfie every hour on the hour may not be the best person to take advice from. But like I said, there are a lot of impressionable people on social media, and what this film Profile is trying to do is just highlight how accessible both information that can lead someone down a bad path is, and how accessible we are to the people that are generating these messages.
And to give you more information about the film itself, it starts with the journalist who's going undercover in an attempt to expose this terrorist organization and the people that are recruiting young women to join showing them. She essentially is pulling all the tricks out of a catfish's toolbox. She makes a fake profile, and on that profile, she lists that she's a new converter to Islam. Just putting that small detail on this Facebook profile is enough to draw in a recruiter like a moth to a flame. From there on, the film evolves into a game of essentially the two of them trying to entice each other in order to serve out their individual goals. And as one can imagine, when dealing with a terrorist, things start to go off the rails, and they are not as understanding as they seem to be. Who knew? It really is the people you expect the least. But for anyone who is interested in seeing this film, it is set for release on Friday, May 14th in limited capacity, so check your local theaters to see if they will be playing the film. And to anyone who was a fan of the film Searching, which starred John Cho, where he is essentially using his daughter's computer in order to find her after she has gone missing. It is produced by the same company that made that film and very much shot in the same style. So if you are looking for a found footage style film that looks like it's going to be a suspenseful thriller, be sure to check out the new film Profile. But right now, we are going to take a quick break on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around until our next segment, as I'm going to be talking about the first foreign language film I will have ever discussed on this podcast, and that is the Swedish film The Unthinkable. And to just go for the triple play of horror, suspense, thriller, this film is based around the idea of how in Sweden all the television, phone, and internet networks all go down at the same time, which I think is just an intriguing concept in and of itself. But the filmmakers took it one step further, as later on in the film they begin to be attacked by a foreign power, which again I think is a bit of a hat on a hat. To reference the previous segment, that's like taking people and putting them into a Saw-like situation where the intent is to really put them to the test psychologically, and then bringing in the shark from Jaws so they have to deal with the external threat of a violent force. But it'll be interesting to talk about the film, so stick around until our next segment to hear more about The Unthinkable. And you've come this far, so why not go a little further? And stick around for our fourth and final segment, as I'm going to be taking a look at the months of May that have been the most profitable in years past. We are halfway through May, so I feel it's appropriate to talk about that topic for this reason. And the CDC really changed the game when it comes to COVID regulations this week, so we could be fast approaching something that resembles normal. And that means movie theaters at higher capacity, if not full, and all of this is happening just before the kickoff to blockbuster season. So that is very intriguing, and back to what our final segment will be about, I'll be taking a look back at the years where May saw its most profitable months, by taking a look at which of them were able to bring in over $1 billion at the box office. Of course, I will also be taking a look at the films that made that happen, and it should be fun, a bit like taking a look at an all-star team, and examining which months had the best film lineup. So be sure to stick around until the very end of the show to hear more about that topic. And don't go anywhere, because the GSMC Movie Podcast will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in the last segment, I just finished talking about the new film Profile, which is a suspense thriller shot in a found footage style, where almost all the shots in this film are from the point of view of a webcam. The premise of the film is based around a reporter who essentially goes undercover in order to catfish a terrorist recruiter. If you think this sounds ridiculous, it is based on true events. There was a reporter who actually did this. She made a fake profile in order to catfish a terrorist recruiter. Unfortunately, while she is trying to expose him and the work that he is doing, she begins to develop feelings for him. But as you can imagine, if you are a fake person on the internet trying to start a relationship with a terrorist recruiter, things are not going to go exactly to plan or go that smoothly. The whole film is essentially a game of cat and mouse, so if you are into suspenseful thrillers, I recommend you check out Profile, and the film will be in select theaters starting Friday, May 14th. The next film I am going to talk about, however, is the film The Unthinkable, which was made available to audiences last week via video on demand. And this film holds the distinction of being the very first foreign language film I am going to be discussing on the podcast. It is a film from Sweden, and it has the very compelling premise of all TV, phone, and internet just stopping all of a sudden. Just imagining if that were to happen in real life, how people would absolutely lose their minds. Just think of all those poor little Insta-hoes that wouldn't be able to post a selfie every minute, or all those people that feel the need to post false information as if it's solid fact. Now, in all seriousness, I think the issues that The Unthinkable will cover will be a tad more consequential, and we will dive into all of that a little bit later on in the segment, but I want to bring you another installment of the GSMC Movie News Report. And I guess I will start off with the topic that seems to be the topic I start off with every single one of these, and that is news about a new superhero film. Though, I guess I could give this one the qualifier, as it is a bit of an anti-hero film, as I am referring to the first trailer for Venom, There Will Be Carnage, being released this week. This sequel, involving everyone's favorite comic book symbiote, will be starring Tom Hardy as he returns as the titular Venom, and he will be battling against Woody Harrelson's character of Carnage, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar with comic book movies, he is essentially just Venom, only he's red. So think of all the merchandising possibilities there are when you introduce a second color.
But this film appears to be a continuation of Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock living with his new other half in a bit of a comedic odd pairing coupling. Unfortunately for him, he at some point in this movie is going to have to go head to head with Woody Harrelson's Carnage. And from the brief clips that I've seen on the film, Woody Harrelson seems to be playing a very unhinged version of his character, so that should be fun to watch. And while there has been an incredible amount of superhero films made in the past decade, and this movie is structured around one of the biggest criticisms about superhero films, how the hero ultimately comes up against just another version of themselves. As in this movie, he is literally going up against another version of whatever Venom is, but red. But who knows, it could be fun, and if you are interested in seeing the film, it is set for release September 24th. But moving on to other news that doesn't involve superheroes, just an actor from a superhero film, Dave Bautista has been announced to be a part of Knives Out 2. He is Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, and will be starring in the two upcoming Zack Snyder films, Army of the Dead and Dune. The former wrestling world champ turned actor will be reuniting with Daniel Craig in Rian Johnston's sequel to the original Knives Out. The two have previously worked together in the James Bond film Spectre, where Bautista played Mr. Hicks, who was the silent enforcer for Christoph Waltz's character, Blofeld. But if this sequel is anything like the original, it should be a good film, and Dave Bautista's presence only adds to that. And I just have to give Bautista a general tip of the cap, as he made a very difficult transition from being a professional wrestler to being a legitimate box office draw. He did follow in the footsteps of The Rock, but it's all the more impressive when you take a look at how old Bautista is while he was doing this transition. So congratulations to the man who was once known as the Animal, and I guess we can now call him the guy with a whole bunch of frickin' tattoos. But regardless of how much ink he has on his skin, he should be able to contribute to Knives Out 2 being a hit just like the original. But in other news, the space race is back on, and I'm not talking about the billionaires with a whole ton of money shooting rockets up into space. I'm talking about when it comes to filmmaking. It was announced a little while ago that Tom Cruise is going to be filming a movie with a few scenes actually taking place on the International Space Station. But the Russians, who are prone to playing spoiler, will be sending a film crew up later in the year in order to film the movie with the working title of Challenge, where it's going to revolve around a female surgeon who is sent up into space to perform surgery on a cosmonaut who is too ill to return to Earth. This will make it the first narrative film primarily filmed in space, so the Russians are essentially peeing in the pool of Tom Cruise. They do really know how to twist the knife, but I just gotta say, with filmmaking being at the point where movies are literally being filmed in space and production companies coordinating with NASA and SpaceX in order to make this happen is really just a crazy thing to see. And who knows, if things are going at the rate at which they're going, maybe in 20 years we'll see the first MCU movie to be filmed on the moon. But moving on to other news, the director Jai Ling became the highest grossing female director of all time. Her film, which translates to Hi Mom, eclipsed the $854 million mark, which moves it ahead of the total collected by Patty Jenkins's Wonder Woman. With a little bit of a tie-in to our first segment, Hi Mom is essentially the plot of Back to the Future, where a daughter goes back in time to meet her mother and make sure that her future life is improved. While it is not really an original premise, you cannot argue with the results, and what is all the more impressive is that this film achieved that box office number without Hi Mom being played in a single theater in the US. And it's nothing new that the Asian market is incredibly important for filmmakers when it comes to making money, but seeing a film that was essentially only shown within the Asian market, and that resulted in it making almost $1 billion. This really just goes to show you how much the film industry has changed. And this film, Hi Mom, is not only going to be significant because it is the highest grossing film to have a female director, but it shows that filmmakers really don't even have to consider the US market to make a whole ton of money at the box office. And keep in mind, this was accomplished during a worldwide pandemic. So congratulations to Jai Ling and all the success her film has had. But to go from one success in the film industry to someone's opinion on why things aren't as successful as they once were, Donald Glover recently said that TV and movies have grown boring because people are afraid of getting canceled, which leads writers to not experiment. He expressed his point of view in a series of tweets, and honestly, I have to say he has a point. The level of sensitivity that exists nowadays and the real power of cancel culture is definitely contributing to a lack of quality when it comes to film and TV. Now, don't get me wrong, I think cancel culture can be beneficial in some cases. I look at the NBA owner, Donald Sterling, who was a blatant racist and an all-around terrible person. He was essentially forced to sell the LA Clippers after a recording of racist comments he made surfaced. So in a situation like that, I can see where the voice of the people making their opinions heard and rooting out someone who is just a terrible human being is beneficial. But we've kind of gotten to the point where it's kind of overkill. Comedians are getting in trouble for things that they said 10 years ago in material that they don't even perform anymore. And in some cases, it really just feels like people are waiting around looking for reasons to get offended. So with those components at play, I can definitely see why writers are being conservative on what they commit to the page, which I think is a real shame. I think that creatives should be able to push boundaries. As long as they're not doing it with malice in their heart, I feel as though there should be avenues where people can voice controversial opinions. Because in doing so, I feel like that opens up an avenue for discussion, which can potentially bring out positive change. But if we're censoring everything before it's even made, I really think that that's a dangerous concept. So, long story short, I agree with Donald Glover. And moving on to the final piece of news of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report, NBC recently announced that they are not going to be airing the 2022 Golden Globe Awards. This is incredibly significant, and I did not think that a network would go as far as to literally boycott the airing of an award show, but I guess people are just that fed up with the Hollywood foreign press. Right now, there are calls for institutional change with that organization from top to bottom, mainly regarding their membership financial and ethical practices, which I have to say in this case, I am all for organizational reform. Personally, I'm very annoyed with some organizations in this country becoming so stagnant that blatant corruption is just widely accepted, with nobody having the intention of changing that. It's good to see a corrupt organization really having the screws put to them on an issue. And I have to say, hats off to NBC for making this move. This is pretty unprecedented, so we will see what results it will have. It is still unclear on whether or not NBC is going to pay for the rights to air the Golden Globes, which is no small financial commitment, sitting at around $22 million. So we will have to wait and see how this saga unfolds. But all in all, that is a pretty crazy story. I am just now realizing I went way over on the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report, so we will call it a day on that, and we will shift into talking about our feature film of this segment, and that is The Unthinkable. This movie holds significance as it is the first foreign language film I will be talking about on the podcast. It is a film from Sweden, and it has the premise of all the TV, phone, and internet networks all going down at the same time, and if that is not compelling enough for you, the country begins to experience military attacks from an unknown country. And I do have to say, when I was watching the trailer and reading the description about this film, I was a little disappointed in that aspect, because I think if you have the concept of just essentially all forms of mass communication being struck down at the same time, that's enough of an engaging concept right there. I personally believe that if you were just allowing the characters to explore that realm, you would find enough compelling material with that premise alone, and I really don't think you have to introduce the concept of military strikes into this, but I'm sure that a couple major explosions won't detract from this film. But the concept of mass communications just being wiped out all at the same time with no explanation sounds like a really fun idea to play with. For one, there would just be the initial shock when that happened, where you're at a loss to explain why all your devices stop working. Then you're pretty much helpless to identify the problem, as you can't Google what's going on, you can't check social media to see if anyone else is experiencing what you're experiencing. And aside from the people around you when this happens, you're not going to be able to communicate with anyone. I think if you were just to build a movie around that premise and examine what direction the different characters go in when it comes to how they react to it, the different approaches they have to dealing with it, and the conflicts that arise because of opposite opinions on the matter would be a compelling story in and of itself. It would sort of be like a desert island type scenario where people need to sort out power dynamics and adapt to a new way of living, so it would have a bit of an element of The Lord of the Flies to it, set to the backdrop of people having to deal without technology and mass communication, which I do have to say, in this day and age, would be an incredibly difficult task for a lot of people. Like I said earlier, people under the age of 16 would be absolutely useless, whereas people on the other end of the age spectrum, who grew up in a time that actually predates the internet, would pretty much shrug it off and say it's like the good old days. So, while that is my ideal premise for a movie where all mass communication is struck down, The Unthinkable decided to just make that one element of the plot, with another major element being that the country is under attack from some foreign power. So, if you are intrigued by either of those elements and the combination of the two of them, as well as not minding subtitles with your movie, The Unthinkable is available now via video on demand, so you don't even have to get up. You can enjoy this doomsday scenario from the comfort of your own home. So once again, be sure to check out The Unthinkable. Right now, however, I will be taking a quick break on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but be sure to stick around for our final segment, as since we are halfway through the month of May and movie theaters are on the road to profitability once more, I thought it would be fun to take a look at the most profitable months of May that the film industry has enjoyed. In doing so, I will be examining the years where the fifth month on the calendar was able to rake in over $1 billion. This list will not be accounting for inflation, so we're just going off of raw total, and I will be examining the films that made it possible for these months to rake in over $1 billion. And by taking a look at these movies, in some cases it'll be easy to explain why those totals were achieved, and in other cases, it will simply be interesting to examine films that tricked audiences into buying a ticket for them. To give you a preview of what I mean, it's fairly obvious as to why some years were able to reach over $1 billion, as they were debuting films that were part of the Avengers franchise, and how it's unbelievable that a film like Blended, which is one of Adam Sandler's terrible rom-coms, was part of the effort to make May a $1 billion month. We have that topic coming up, so be sure to stick around. The GSMC Movie Podcast will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
And welcome back into the fourth and final segment of the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I've finished talking about the new foreign film, The Unthinkable, which is available via video on demand, and it tells the story of how Sweden loses all of its TV, phone, and internet networks all at the same time, and after that, they begin to be attacked by some foreign power. Now, I think that first aspect of the film is an incredibly compelling plot, so much so I'm not even going to mind reading the subtitles in order to watch the film. So if anyone is looking for a suspenseful thriller with a concept I think is pretty fresh and original, I say check out The Unthinkable. But moving on to our final topic of the show, I thought it would be interesting to take a look back at the months of May that have made the most money at the box office. It does appear that we are getting closer and closer to things being back to somewhat normal, which hopefully will contribute to the theater industry returning to normal. And while theaters are starting to make money, the totals of this year absolutely pale in comparison to some of the figures that have been achieved in years past. As May is usually one of the highest grossing months of the year, because in many people's opinion, it is the kick-off of blockbuster season. Up until the pandemic, you would have to go all the way back to 2006 to find a year where the month of May didn't gross over $800 million. So the month of May is incredibly profitable at the box office, and it has been a time on the calendar where there are some really great tentpole films being released, as well as some not-so-great ones. So we're going to dive into all of that on this segment, and just to let everyone know, these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. We are just going off the raw total of dollars generated. But without further ado, let's get into it and start with the year where the month of May grossed $1 billion for the first time. This happened back in 2009, and audiences primarily showed out for the first installment in J.J. Abrams's, that is not an easy name to pluralize, but anyways, that guy's Star Trek film series. That film contributed roughly 10% of the month's gross, and was closely followed by X-Men Origins Wolverine. And this is one of the films I'll be talking about that really just suckered audiences in. This film came 3 years after the terrible Last Stand, and people are hoping that Wolverine in a standalone movie is going to be interesting. And this movie disappointed on so many levels, from terrible special effects, to terrible actors in it, to terrible characters, to what they did to Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool. It is almost a crime that this film made over $170 million at the box office. Other notable movies at the box office that month were Angels and Demons, the Tom Hanks film, which was a sequel to The Da Vinci Code. It made over $100 million, as did another sequel, which was Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian. It really is all about the sequels when it comes to movies and making money. And another sequel that enjoyed a big payday at the box office, but would go on to be absolutely torn apart by both audiences and critics, was Terminator Salvation. This was the film that starred Christian Bale and the origin of his epic freakout where he just went off on a crew member. And ultimately, that proved to be the most significant aspect of this film that somehow made $90 million at the box office. Other than that, the only real notable films that were in theaters during the month of May in 2009 were the Pixar film Up, and for some effing reason, the Matthew McConaughey film Ghosts of Girlfriends Past. I know 32 million isn't a lot when it comes to box office, but if you contributed to that, be ashamed of yourself. But moving right along to the next year, where a month of May would bring in over $1 billion at the box office, that would be 2011, with the highest grossing film in this month being Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. I believe we talked about this film on a previous episode, as it is the film that had the highest budget of any movie. Being released on May 20th, it had just under 2 weeks to make $166 million. This total allowed On Stranger Tides to just edge out the Marvel Cinematic Universe film, Thor, as everyone's favorite Norse god was making his film debut. Also making its debut that month was The Hangover Part 2, and it's all the more impressive it comes in third on this list, given that it was released during the final weekend of that month. So it had the shortest run of the top 3 grossing films of that month, but was able to bring in a pretty respectable haul. Fast 5 was also in theaters this month, and inexplicably was able to rake in $133 million. I gotta tell you, I really just don't understand what people see in these films, but they are profitable. But a film that was profitable during this month, that was actually good, was the film Bridesmaids. The film made over $90 million in the month of May, and was a big sleeper hit. After that, we pretty much get into the kids' territory with movies like Kung Fu Panda 2 and Rio. But aside from those films, not many others playing during the month of May in 2011 were that significant or memorable, unless you are a fan of Tyler Perry, and for some reason paid money to see Medea's Big Happy Family. Moving right along, we see the first instance of May grossing over $1 billion in back-to-back years, as 2012 would also be a very profitable one as well, and it is not hard to see why, considering the Avengers debuted on May 4th. Now that is Star Wars Day, but that would not stop the ultimate crossover film from absolutely dominating at the box office, as it would single-handedly account for half of the month's gross total, raking in an astronomical $532 million. With a dominant force like that sitting at number 1, it almost doesn't even matter what other films were playing in theaters at the time. The only film that would even come close to $100,000 would be Men in Black 3. After that, 2012 pumped out the likes of Johnny Depp's vampire flick, Dark Shadows, a movie based off of a Parker's Brother game, Battleship, and Sacha Baron Cohen's The Dictator. The first Hunger Games film would also debut in this month, but it only made $23 million, which puts it at number 8 in terms of gross during that month, which I guess you can just attribute to everybody having Avengers fever that month. I know I was one of the people that turned out to see it. But if we move on from 2012 and fast forward a year, we get the most profitable month of May in cinema history. In May of 2013, movie theaters would make $1,143 million. This was largely on the back of Iron Man 3, which was the first MCU film following the Avengers and was based around the premise of Iron Man coming face to face with the Mandarin. Unfortunately, everyone was duped here, as Ben Kingsley's character turned out to be an actor for hire portraying the Mandarin. But this bait and switch did not stop the film from raking in close to $400 million during this month. And another highly anticipated film that was playing during this month was Star Trek Into Darkness. This film, much like Iron Man 3, was built around the introduction of a legendary movie villain, and that was Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan. The film would make the very respectable total of $169 million, and after that, the next highest grossing film was, yet again, another Fast and Furious movie. Fast and Furious 6 was able to bring in $146 million. Again, how? I really have no idea. But whatever formula those stupid movies have cultivated, it works. Another film that was able to work magic at the box office this month was The Great Gatsby, which was a film pretty much sold by its soundtrack, and Leonardo DiCaprio playing a suave millionaire in the very epic adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic work. This film was able to bring in $123 million, and looking back, I feel like it gave DiCaprio's career a little bit of a shot in the arm. Other than that, some notable films of the month were The Hangover Part 3, bringing that series to its conclusion. The Croods also arrived in theaters, as well as Now You See Me, and the god-awful film After Earth, which starred Will Smith and son Jaden. So while 2013 did have the most profitable May we have ever seen, we can definitely say that it was a top-heavy one, being carried by the likes of Iron Man 3, Star Trek Into Darkness, and again, for some reason, Fast and Furious 6. But moving right along to 2014, this month of May was also carried by Marvel intellectual property, even though it was a film distributed by Sony. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 took home the #1 spot at the box office, raking in over $191 million. Unfortunately for that Spider-Man lead, Andrew Garfield, it would be the final time he would appear in a Spider-Man film, although it still remains to be seen if he will have a cameo appearance in the upcoming Spider-Man No Way Home. Godzilla also hit theaters during this time, making $171 million, and setting the stage for what we recently saw in Godzilla vs. Kong. Also hitting theaters that month was another Marvel property owned by a different studio, and this was X-Men Days of Future Past. And honestly, this may have been the best X-Men film ever made. But regardless of where it falls in that conversation, it did make a nice chunk of change, raking in $152 million. Other notable films released during the month of May in 2014 were Maleficent, which was able to make $50 million during the month, despite it being released on May 30th, and the Zac Efron, Seth Rogen film Neighbors. So, moving on, we get to 2015, and another year that had the benefit of an Avengers film coming out. Avengers Age of Ultron made its debut on the very first day of the month and would go on to gross $427 million in May. So, during this month, when a bunch of guys went to go see Avengers 2, their girlfriends would go see Pitch Perfect 2. I guess you could say those two films are somewhat comparable to the effect they had on cinema, but all joking aside, Pitch Perfect was able to make $147 million. And another notable film that made its debut in May of 2015 was Mad Max Fury Road, which would make $116 million that month. Other than that, the month of May played host to a bunch of not-so-interesting crap, such as San Andreas, Poltergeist, and Paul Blart Mall Cop 2. That's another movie. If you contributed to that movie's box office, you should be ashamed of yourself. I don't care if you're a parent bringing your kids, if you were a kid unwillingly brought to the movie, you need to think about what you did. But from May of 2015, we have to jump forward 2 years before we get another May that grossed over $1 billion. 2016 and 2017 both fell short, but 2018 was able to get above the $1 billion threshold, thanks in no small part to another Avengers film, this time Avengers Infinity War. This film would gross over $350 million that month, but I think the craziest stat attached to its box office is that it was released on April 27th and still managed to make over $282 million during those last few days in April. But that movie would do much of the heavy lifting for May, but Deadpool 2 would also contribute to a significant portion of the box office as it made $231 million on its way to becoming the highest grossing R-rated film of all time. It would only be able to hold that record for 1 year as it was supplanted by The Joker. And the third highest grossing film of that month would be Solo, a Star Wars story, which would make $119 million, despite the fact that it was universally panned as being a major letdown for fans of the character. And maybe that's the reason that Harrison Ford has said when he's done playing Indiana Jones, he wants no one else to play it, because he may just be tired of seeing young actors try and fail to portray his characters. But back to May of 2018, there were not many other significant films. Although I will say the film The Book Club that came out that month sounds absolutely hysterical from a plot standpoint, as it stars Diane Keaton, Jane Fonda, Candice Bergen, and Mary Steenburgen as 4 women who read 50 Shades of Grey in their book club. That movie just sounds interesting the same way a car crash sounds interesting. Other than that, though, there is not that much interesting about May of 2018. But moving on to May of 2019, which was the last May to gross over $1 billion for obvious reasons, we have another installment in the Avengers franchise raking in a whole ton of money, and that is Avengers Endgame, which made $382 million during the month, on its way to becoming the highest grossing film of all time until earlier this year when James Cameron released Avatar again. But I'm sure someday in the future, when we get to the 50th Marvel movie, Avengers Endgame will have a chance to take back the crown of highest grossing theatrical release. Other major players during this month was the live-action adaptation of Aladdin, which made $154 million. Also, Detective Pikachu earned an impressive $125 million. And John Wick 3 Parabellum would make $117 million. So once again, this was a very top-heavy month at the box office, but one significant standout was Godzilla, King of Monsters, making $19 million, as it only had one day to do so, as it was released on May 31st. Other than that, not much else to report other than the movie Booksmart. But 2019 would be the last year that the month of May brought in $1 billion at the box office for obvious reasons. This year's month of May has brought in $52 million thus far, and hopefully that number continues to grow, and hopefully this time next year, $1 billion at the box office is once again realistic for the month of May. But that will pretty much do it for me on the GSMC Movie Podcast. And again, I do want to thank everyone who listens to the podcast. It means a ton to me personally. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so you're always notified when a new episode drops. And if you haven't already, please write us a nice review. Those really do help us a lot. And be sure to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I do promise you, I say a lot more outlandish stuff on there than I do here. But that'll do it for this episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast. I've been your host, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.